Hey everyone, this is week number 3 of the Christian Apologetics curriculum, and this week we're going to be looking at even more evidence to help us choose which worldview is most likely to be true. So, to review, last week we learned how the atheist or materialist view believed that the world or universe had to be in a static state, or the universe had to be infinite. Therefore, there was no need for a creator or starting point. But then the discoveries of the high powered telescope showed us that the stars and galaxies up in the sky were not static, but were accelerating or moving away from us. Um, this showed that the universe was expanding, it wasn't static. So, this idea of an expanding universe was very shocking and contradicted what a lot of atheists believed at the time. The expanding universe, you see, if we take it in reverse, it would simply imply that a the universe had a single point of origin or a beginning. So, one thing to clarify is that when I refer to the Big Bang or Big Bang Theory, it isn't necessarily a description of what caused the Big Bang. All it is a description of the first effects of that beginning point. So, you see on the picture to the right there, it doesn't necessarily say that there was an explosion and what caused the explosion to cause this universe that's expanding. It could have been like a slow expansion. Um, if you see on the picture on the bottom of that picture. So all it is a description of a single starting point and the universe expanding. So there are alternative theories as to the expanding universe. Not as everyone initially believed that a single point origin or the Big Bang theory was the only way to explain the expanding universe. So other scientists had alternative explanations. Sir Fred Hoyle in 1948, he was very against the Big Bang theory. So he formulated a different theory called the steady state theory. He stated that the universe was expanding, but there was an equal amount of creation of new galaxies to maintain a steady density of galaxies. So the universe was infinitely expanding. Um, New galaxies popped up to maintain the uh, the same number of galaxies, so that there didn't necessarily have to be a beginning or an end. It just infinitely grew. So the next slide shows a kind of a description of what that looked like. If you look at the top picture, the Big Bang shows a small, like a cluster of mass, and then it expands and everything kind of gets spread out apart. If you look at the steady state model, as it's expanding, the density of galaxies stays the same. So just more and more galaxies are just popping into existence. So kind of like mini Big Bangs continuously happening to make up for this steady state model. So it's like with any theory, how do we test which theory is true? A mathematician in 1948 calculated that if the Big Bang was true, the origin was a hot, dense mass. If it then exploded, there would be a low level of radiation that was spread equally throughout the universe. Um, if if the Big Bang was true, he actually calculated the numbers, and he said that there should be a background radiation or temperature of 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. So similar to like the wet street example. Remember we said we looked at a wet street and said what could have caused this wet street. We looked at the different clues, like were there pieces of balloons on the ground? Was the trees and houses and grass wet as well? So all those are all examples of how we look at evidence to prove which theory is most likely to be true. Let's see what they found. Let's ask our scientist, Matilda Kim. Is there background radiation? Let's check. Hold it. Wow, it is 2.7 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that was just, and please disregard Celsius. It is not Celsius. I was mistaken. Um, Space temperature is different from Earth temperature, and it's a different unit altogether, so disregard that. In any case, so they actually did find that there was this low-level background radiation throughout the universe, and this is the story of how they found it. These two scientists, Arnold Penzias and Robert Wilson, they were physicists. They were just, everyday physicists. They were working at the Bell Labs, and if you see in the background of that picture, they were listening on this huge listening device, but they just couldn't get rid of this background buzzing noise. They isolated, the trees, the wildlife, they isolated everything else out, but they just couldn't get rid of that sound. So they remembered that there was some kind of theory about some kind of background radiation, and so they contacted a different scientist at Princeton, and he actually had the instruments and whatnot to measure this background radiation, and it equaled exactly 2.7 degrees above absolute zero, which was strong evidence for the Big Bang Theory. So another theory, instead of the Big Bang or the steady state universe, was the oscillating universe. This theory says that the universe is actually uh, expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. Um, Expanding because of the explosion initially, contracting because of uh, gravitational pull, and then it collapsing on itself, which makes it expand and collapse infinitely. So it kind of gets rid of that finite universe, or it says necessarily doesn't necessarily mean that there was a beginning. So just so happens that we are on the expanding phase of that oscillating universe. The problem with the oscillating universe theory was when they actually looked at the evidence for it. Um, if you see the numbers on the picture on the right, for the number 8 to occur, I'm sorry, 5. Number 5, you see how the gravitational pull of the masses has to be great enough for the universe to collapse upon itself. But when they've actually did the math to see how much mass you would need for the gravitational pull to do that, they found that the universe was just too spread out, and actually accelerating at such a pace that it would never reach a high enough density for it to collapse like that. So it pretty much debunked this theory of the oscillating universe. So not only to shift gears, not only with the development and study of the three different theories of expansion of the universe, there was also a very important development in science. Stephen Hawking, there's been books and movies written about him. He's a very brilliant physicist that lived, and I think he died just recently. What he was known for He said in 1968 he solved the field equations for the theory of relativity. And I couldn't really begin to explain this, but um, it's a theory of relativity of space and time and how the space and time expands as time progresses. And but if you see the picture on the right, if the universe is space time is all that glittery stuff on the top. If you go back in time, space time eventually gets smaller, smaller, smaller until it reaches a singular point right there, and where time equals zero. Well, when time equals zero, space equals zero. And when space equals zero, how much matter can you fit into zero space? So the answer is zero. So this was a really important development. I'll show you how that helps us. So we use this to evaluate the four different worldviews. Number one, we said that yes, the universe was finite, which means it had a beginning. And then number two, with Stephen Hawking's discovery, uh, when time equals zero, matter ceased to exist. So there was a time when there was zero matter and zero space. Okay, I know this is really heady stuff, but um, even if you don't understand it now, it's important if you hear it later in life, you will have kind of understood just the basics of it, and it'll really help you. Okay, so let's look at the four theories or worldviews and see how the two pieces of evidences will help us decide which could possibly be true or not true. So in theism, um, Genesis says this exact thing. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So, of course, we believe in a finite universe that it had a beginning. So this is consistent with what the Big Bang Theory has shown, that there was a beginning. The other part of it is the Stephen Hawking's space-time equaling zero. God is always described in the Bible as transcending space and time. He describes himself as I am that I am, eternally present and not really of this of our not really of this earth, except of course when he came down as Jesus. But um, so theism actually is consistent with those two new evidences. Pantheism, if you remember, pantheism is where the universe is God, everything in the universe is God, and um, created this universe. So if God is the universe, matter is God. And but the problem with that is if you look at Stephen Hawking's conclusions, that at a point in space time where matter doesn't exist, then this God doesn't exist. So that means matter should have arisen from nothing, or that God would matter was zero, so God was zero. In any case, pantheism doesn't really work out with those two theories. I'll explain better on Saturday. Atheism has similar problems with the two developments. Like we've always talked about, the fact that an expanding universe shows that it had a finite or beginning, it really begs to question what caused the beginning. So atheism has a lot of problems with that because it really depended on the world not needing a beginning. Um, and then with Stephen Hawking's development of time equals zero, space equals zero, um, nothing existed in this universe. So how did matter arise from nothing. So that's the problem they have in proving their theories right now. Deism, which is where they believe that there was a God that created the universe and no longer interacts with the universe. Actually, this worldview is still consistent with those two new evidences because God is apart from the space time of this universe. It doesn't, it could have created the universe and just not continued to interact with the universe. So it has a beginning, and there was a God that was apart from the universe. So it is consistent with those two new evidences. Although we've showed you, the arguments for how the finite universe supports theism, there are other schools of thought. There's objections. Other people have differing um, opinions. So there's two other bigger objections or theories as to how the expanding universe and finite nature of the universe can not necessarily mean that there's a God. Okay, so one of these theories is called inflationary cosmology. They talk about how, I'll just go through these briefly because they are really kind of hard to understand, but I'll just mention them, okay? So number one is called inflationary cosmology, and it describes a universe that started expanding at a rapid rate close to the beginning of time, similar to the Big Bang, but um, it still has the same problem, and it doesn't really answer how matter arose uh, from the beginning. Okay, that's all we'll say about that. Number two, quantum cosmology. They propose that if you go back in time almost to t equals 0, uh, it's actually t equals 10 to the negative 43, or Planck time, there existed matter that was quantum, it's called quantum physics, where it is the matter is so small it doesn't really um, exist in time as we know it. Different laws of physics apply to these matter because they're so small. Um, the problem with that, they found though, that they don't quite know how they went from this timeless quantum state and then moved to a universe time state. So it doesn't really explain that transition. And also, it doesn't really, the math trick they use to explain how quantum particles could get rid of a beginning point, a lot of people find that it's not quite valid. So, in any case, I'll just mention those briefly, but there are differing schools of thought as to the expanding universe. Okay. So now that we have been discussing cosmology, what has the evidence shown you so far? Has it proven to you that God exists? Maybe not quite there yet, but hopefully it's laid a groundwork for the possibility of it being true. I'm excited to go over it with you this Sabbath, and we have one more week to go before we have a long break. All right, see you then.